Hi folks, and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video, I'm going to be building the 1/35th scale Lanchester First World War British armoured car by Copper State Models. I've been really impressed with Copper State kits in the past, and you may have seen my Romfell and my Minerva videos. If not, there's a link to those in the description. The kit comes moulded in a standard light grey plastic, and the details are really nicely rendered, with rivets, leaf springs, panel lines, everything you want really. The spokes on the wheels are also really nicely moulded. They may be a little over scale, but that's just down to the limitations of injection moulding. And without some serious surgery and skill, I'm not going to get them in scale, so they'll do for me. And before we get into the video proper, I just want to give a huge thanks to my patrons. Your support helps keep the channel running, and I appreciate it so much. If you're interested in becoming a patron with early access videos, high quality galleries, and fairly frequent updates, then head over to www.patreon.com/LPJmodels. I also have a Discord server that has just breached 200 members. There are group builds and plenty of discussion rooms. It'll be great to see you there. As a quick note, I've also started putting votes up as to what paint scheme or kit I'm going to build on my Patreon. It was a bit of a close call between the tricolour Belgian scheme and the brown scheme. The brown scheme won, which I'm slightly grateful for because the tricolour scheme looked really hard. Right, let's get on with the build. As usual, the parts were removed from their sprues with my Godhand single blade sprue cutters. These leave such a clean cut with minimal cleanup, so they're ideal and they really speed up my building process. The build started on the lower chassis, with suspension elements glued onto the sides. The leaf springs are really nice and crisp, which is a nice surprise. There was a small amount of seam cleanup, but not as much as you'd expect. To add a bit more realism, I decided to drill out the exhaust pipe, even though you won't see it. I know it's there. Oh, and I can't forget the texture. Even a small amount of Mr. Surfacer stippled on with an old brush can add a lot of realism to a part. Here I'm using Mr. Surfacer 1000 that's a bit thicker than the 1500, meaning texture builds up just a bit quicker. The way Copper State engineered the lower chassis is great. The cross beams attached to the whole floor means that everything's true and straight and square when you glue it together. And there's nothing worse than having a misaligned chassis assembly when you're building something like this. Just pretend you didn't see that. The radiator slots in after you've put the two halves together. I didn't think this would fit very well, but it fit perfectly. I was really nicely surprised. The two cab sides were held together by a crossbeam that also doubled up as a headlamp holder. This helped to make sure that the sides were vertical and true whilst you were gluing them together. It's a small addition, but quality of life features like this elevate model manufacturers, and I wish they'd do it more. The turret was a 6-piece assembly with a base, 4 sides and a roof. Assemblies like this can be tricky to put together, but this was designed well enough that there were no problems. The tyres were the only part of the kit where cleanup was a chore. The seam lines in the tread patterns are a pain to clean up. I needed some folded, fine sandpaper and a thin coat of glue just to level them out. These are so visible on the finished model that it's essential I got them spot on. After putting all the pieces together, I did a final spot check and spotted a few areas that needed a tiny dab of filler. I used the water-based AK Grey putty for this and applied it with a brush. Cleanup was simple with a cotton bud dipped in water. To add some more visual interest to the final model, I wanted to add some tarps. For this I used a post-it note that I cut into small squares and some VMS paper shaper. The paper shaper was spread liberally over the paper. When it had completely absorbed in, I folded it into shape. When folding up tarps like this, don't do it with military precision, you want them to look natural and realistic. You can add in little folds and creases with the paper shaper, just to give you extra depth. And the thing I like about this VMS paper shaper is you can fold and manipulate the paper within reason without it tearing, meaning you can drape it and get it to sag naturally over any parts that you hang it on. Once you're happy with your tarps, you need to coat them with some acrylic binders, which is an acrylic resin. This gives them some structure, and some strength, and a better surface to paint on. And after 2 evenings of work, the build was complete. I love it when kits fall together like this because you can get to the good stuff so much quicker. Okay, so let's get on with some priming. The whole model was primed in a layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500. This was thinned with 60% Mr. Leveling thinners and 40% Mr. Surfacer. And you're probably wondering where the black basing is, and well, I thought I'd do something different for a change. For the main paintwork, I decided to use some Tamiya colours. I haven't used Tamiya paints to paint a model in I can't remember how long. But anyway, the colour of the vehicle was supposed to be similar to RAF Light Earth. So to start with, I mixed up a shadow colour using Tamiya Flat Earth, Dark Yellow No. 2, and the rather suspiciously diarrhea looking Red Brown No. 2. This was followed up by a more extreme post-shade layer. This was mixed from Flat Earth, Red Brown No. 2 and Black. This was thinned quite heavily, around 70% thinner, and was sprayed around all the details on the model with a focus on the lower hull and undersurfaces. Now it's time to start adding some highlights to the build and get closer to that RAF Light Earth colour. I know it's not going to be spot on, but you know. This first highlight layer was made up of a mix of Flat Earth and Dark Yellow No. 2 in a roughly 1:1 ratio. This was sprayed towards the upper surfaces of the model to give it a kind of modulated look, but also to make some of the details and raised areas pop. For the final highlight layer, I used 1 part Flat Earth to 2 parts Dark Yellow. This was focused on the extreme upper surfaces and the areas that would catch the light the most. The flatbed of the truck was made from wooden planks. I wanted to emulate this with a worn, chipped wooden surface, so the bed was initially painted with a layer of Vallejo brown sand mixed with stencil. When it comes to basing wood grain, any light creamy colour will do, so it doesn't matter too much what you use. This was a bit of a last minute decision, so it wasn't really planned very well. I'm just going to have to roll with it. I used a mix of burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oils mixed with VMS Oil Expert Matte to help speed up the drying time. The oil paints were applied with an old tatty brush and then dragged and manipulated to try and emulate wood grain. A few folks have asked me to do a fully fledged wood grain tutorial, and I quite like the idea. If you'd like to see one or you've got any other video ideas, just let me know in the comments. Once the oils were dry and given a layer of VMS satin varnish, I had a new product to try. This VMS chipping medium was delivered at the beginning of the video and I was itching to use it. I gave the truck bed a few light passes of the VMS chipping medium. This was then left to dry. One thing I've noticed about this product already is it doesn't have the surface tension issues some of the other chipping products have. This was then followed by a layer of the base colour. This wasn't applied in a solid colour but mainly around the edges. This is because most of the foot traffic would be in the middle of the panel, so this is the area where I wanted the most wear. The paint was then chipped with some warm water and a soft sable brush. But unfortunately, because the colours are so similar, it's quite difficult to see the effect. Just a quick note that I forgot to mention earlier. There's currently a group build on my Discord server that's just gone live. The theme is sci-fi and alternate history, so there's so much scope you can play with. It'd be great if you joined in. There's a link to the Discord server in the description of this video. Okay, now it's time for some decals. The surface was prepared with VMS Set and Fix. This was applied straight over the paint surface. I try and avoid extra clear coats when I can because there's just more to go wrong. But luckily, with modern decals and setting solutions, a gloss coat isn't always necessary. Once the few decals were in place, the decals were treated with VMS Decal Softener. This really helps the decals to settle down and conform to the surface details, especially on kits like this where there are prominent rivets. I then picked out some of the raised details on the kit with a mix of Vallejo English uniform and ivory with a fine sable brush. The leaf springs were painted with AK 3rd Gen acrylic smoke black. I'm fairly new to these paints, but they seem quite nice. They're similar to Vallejo model colour, but they're a bit thinner and the coverage is just as good. I do have a build planned in the future where I use them exclusively for the base coats, so I'm looking forward to experimenting with them and trying them out further. The tyres were painted with a mix of MRP dark sea grey and black. These were slightly thinned with Mr. Levelling Thinner and sprayed on at around 8 psi. I never like the look when I brush paint a tyre, so I decided to spray these, and because I didn't have a reverse circle mask, I had to freehand them. To hide the carrier film on the decals, I sprayed over a moderate layer of VMS Matte Varnish HD. I'm a bit gutted I missed the opportunity to do a wheel pun this time. I must have been tired. For the first chipping layer, I used a coarse sponge and Vallejo German Camouflage Beige, slightly thinned with water. I'm never 100% happy with how sponge chipping comes out, so I often relegate this to the first layer, which often isn't usually that visible. I use it as a light scuffs and scratches layer and also a guide for darker chipping later. In an ideal world I'd brush chip both layers, but I don't think I have the patience. Talking of brush chipping, the second chipping layer was painted with VMS Chippernick CN01. Colour-wise it's very similar to Vallejo German Sea Black Brown, but it's a bit warmer. This was applied really carefully with my Artis Opus 20 Kolinsky Sable brush. These darker chips were painted inside the lighter chips. Not every one, but enough to make it look nice and worn and chipped. With the chipping layer done, it was time to add some light worn dust effects. The entire model was coated in 2 layers of VMS chipping fluid. I then used some very thin coats of MRP sand to build up some dust effects. I initially wasn't happy with the colour I chose after I'd applied it, but it all worked out okay in the end. It just looked too chalky and didn't fit with the vision I had in my head. As before, I used warm water and a soft brush to wear away some of that paint. The effect is really subtle, but I think it adds an extra dimension and more depth to the model. To further enhance and deepen the dust effects, I used AK Dust and Dirt Sand Yellow. This was painted lightly over the lower surfaces in any area where dust would collect. It was then blended and streaked with this rather funky looking brush by Terry Harrison. This was lightly moistened with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light, just to help blend it in. Also, I had a really derpy moment when recording the wash sections of this build, so unfortunately they're missing. So quickly to recap, I used Abteilung 502 Sepia and Universal Weathering Carrier and pin washed the entire model. I'm now going to add some more depth and texture to the dusty areas of the model. I'm using MIG Splash's Dry Step effect to build up volume and texture, especially on the lower surfaces and areas where the dust would collect. These layers are also helping to shift the tone of the chalky dust layer I sprayed earlier. I don't want to completely hide it, I just want it to look more natural. The thing I like about this MIG Splashes effect is you can build it up quite nicely and apply quite a bit of texture, whilst still being able to blend it. The wheels were also given the same dust treatment. The dust was applied with a brush, slightly more thinned than before, and then cleaned up with a cotton bud. The tarps I made from post-it notes and VMS Paper Shaper were primed and then painted with MRP colours. Shadows and highlights were then applied with Vallejo colours. On one of the tarps, I wanted it to have a more distinctive look. This was painted in white, and then was given stripes with a mix of Vallejo Hull Red and Dark Vermilion. I didn't realise how out of practice I was with my brush painting until I tried this, so the lines are a bit wobbly, but it came out okay. Shading multicoloured items is quite tricky. I find a dark purple-grey mix works great. So I used a mix of Vallejo Prussian Blue, Dark Vermilion and AK Smoke Black just to add some depth to this Wilco Value tea towel that the crew are carrying around. The tarpaulins were fixed in place with a dot of white glue. The running boards were made out of wood, bare wood, and I'm a bit fed up with using oil paints all the time, so I'm going to try something a bit different this time. I used a high grit sanding stick to scratch in some wood grain texture. This doesn't have to be perfect, but I just wanted that texture to be there. I then added some damage to the ends of the planks with a scalpel blade. Once I was happy with the texturising, I gave the plank a layer of MRP pale wood mixed with clear dope linen version 1. I wanted the unditching boards to look like pale, silvered, unfinished wood, so I started with this tan grey sort of colour. For the first layer of wood grain, I mixed up hull red and smoke black. This was cut with VMS Airbrush Thinners 2.0 to slow down the drying time and also cut down the surface tension. This is going to be built up in very thin layers. The first layer was almost like a wash to bring out some of that sanded wood grain texture. In the next layers I brushed in some wood grain. I used various pictures of wood to get a feel to how the grain would play out on the surface. This was brushed on carefully so I had a hard edge and a soft, feathered blended edge. This first mix was built up in several intensities with several different patterns, just to make the piece look very natural. I also added a few dots of the mixture just to simulate knots. It's time to add a bit more of a silvered element to the plank, so I used a mix of Vallejo green grey and stencil with the VMS airbrush thinner again. This was done really sparingly and built up in very light layers. This step also helped to define some of the earlier grain I'd painted. If you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. For the final layer, I wanted to add a bit more saturation and depth to the unditching board. For this I used a mix of Vallejo Field Drab, Hull Red and Smoke Black. Once again, heavily thinned. I was really pleased and surprised with how these turned out. They were given a very light dusting with the dust effects from earlier, and then placed on the model. It's now time to attach and paint some of the finer details of the build. The headlamps were painted and then glued in place with VMS Flexi Superglue. And I also added some oil stains to the rag I painted earlier. This was done with AK grease stains straight out of the bottle and then blended in whilst they were in place. I've run out of Mr. Colored GX2 and can't find any anywhere at the moment, so the MG was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. For the metallic layer, I mixed up a dark colour out of alclad gunmetal, steel and jet exhaust. Gunmetal on its own is way too blue, so I cut it down with the other metallic colours just to make it look more realistic. This was given a very light dry brush with Mr. Metal Colour Dark Iron. This is a buffable metallic paint, so the more friction you apply, the shinier it becomes. I wanted the sleeve of the MG to match the vehicle, so this was given a layer of VMS chipping fluid and then a layer of the base coat. Once again, the paint was chipped and scratched away with warm water. This time I used an interdental brush just to get some more defined chips. The machine gun was then glued in place with fast setting styrene cement. The turret was then put into place, and the build was complete. Once again, I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. You guys are the best, and you really help motivate me on these projects. And I also want to give a huge thanks to you, the viewer. Without you, this channel wouldn't exist, so I thank you so much. Just don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I also want to give a huge shout out to the Plastic Posse podcast and the Sprue Cutters Union. These podcasts are great to have on whilst I'm working at the workbench, and have some inspiring interviews and some great discussion topics, well worth a listen. Also, don't forget to leave me a comment, let me know how I've done, whether it's awful or brilliant or in between. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.